What is going on, everybody? And welcome back to another episode of Your Requests. This is a segment on my channel where you guys request movies for me to check out, and I have been loving doing this. If you can't tell, I've watched quite a few of your requests already, and it's been really fun to just like hit random movies that I just probably would never pick on my own, either things that I haven't heard of or things that I just don't have pushed up far on my watch list. And I had never heard of this movie before. I looked into it after you requested it and saw that it was directed by Robert Altman, who I watched my first Altman movie last year, the year before, The Long Goodbye, and I adored that movie. And I've been meaning to watch more of Altman's work since then. And I thought the premise of this was really fascinating because I always loved history growing up. I was a big fan of history. I always did really well in history classes because I just find researching the history of not just the United States, but just globally fascinating, and how we don't often learn from history, which I think is really interesting when you're watching this movie in particular. And also, this movie is a part of the Criterion Collection. So this is also a part of my segment on my channel called the Criterion Corner, where I review movies in the Criterion Collection for you guys. So it's really cool that that was a bit of a twofer, and I'm excited to tell you about the movie Secret Honor today. Secret Honor is directed by Robert Altman. In his New Jersey study, Richard Nixon retraces the missteps of his political career, attempting to absolve himself of the responsibility for Watergate and lambasting President Gerald Ford's decision to pardon him. His monologue explores his personal life and describes his upbringing and his mother. A tape recorder, a gun, and whiskey are his only companions during the entire monologue, which is tinged with the vitriol and paranoia that puzzled the public during his presidency. So, I was really excited to watch this movie after you requested it. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of history, and I thought this movie was awesome. I was really impressed by it, not just because it is one actor in one location for an hour and 30 minutes, but because it is one actor in one location and it's enthralling. Every second of this movie is completely and totally fascinating. And I will say, if you're not a fan of history or interested in like US presidents or anything about that, you probably won't get much out of this movie. But as someone who really appreciates going through history and studying history, I thought this movie was really interesting because it discloses at the beginning of the film a lot of this is made up. It's not really elements of Richard Nixon's life. I'm sure that Robert Altman, working with whoever he worked on with this movie, took things as to what they would assume about the president and put it towards Philip Baker Hall's performance. And I'm excited to tell you about it today. So the plot description broke it down perfectly. Philip Baker Hall plays Richard Nixon. We see him go into his study in his home in New Jersey, and he's reflecting on his political career. He talks about Watergate and how he can't stand the way that it was handled, tries to justify his actions, but then tries to absolve himself of any guilt, goes back through his early childhood memories, things with his mother, looks at all these portraits on his wall of former presidents and people in the government, and just has conversations with them. And it's just watching this man sort of go into this diluted rant about his life as president of the United States. So like I said, I thought this movie was really fantastic, and there are a ton of reasons for it. For starters, Philip Baker Hall as Richard Nixon in this movie, this has got to be one of the best performances I've ever seen. So many people, when they're trying to do a presidential impersonation, it feels like caricature. This doesn't. This feels like Philip Baker Hall is Richard Nixon. It's almost horrifying when you're watching it, how just completely and totally accurate it is, not just to his vocal inflection, but like the way he moves his body, the way he kind of stammers over his words. Like, I was just completely enthralled by his performance while I was watching it. Like, I couldn't believe how much dedication that he had to this role. And there's so many moments where he just goes on these unhinged tirades where he's like thrashing his body around, and it's like he's by himself. He's recording himself in this recorder, and I just thought it was so interesting watching his performance, and he just really goes for it the entire movie. I was also really impressed by the visual presentation. Altman works with his cinematographer in a way that I think captures this space to keep it interesting. It's so hard a lot of times with bottle films, which are, if you're unfamiliar, a bottle film is a film that takes place in one place. You don't leave the setting for the entirety of the movie, and you set it in one room, so it's all going to hinge on how the camera moves and how the lead actor performs. I've already said the lead actor, phenomenal in this movie. But the camera work in this is truly incredible. I think it cuts in the perfect moments. It knows when to hold on long take sequences perfectly. It knows exactly when to cut away. There's interesting use of reflections in this movie, and the way that presidential portraits are stationed throughout the room. I just really love that. I think the visuals accompany just what President Nixon in this movie is tirading on about. I really liked that a lot. And I think for an hour and a half movie that's just a guy talking in a room, you get what you need to know out of this character because they're not afraid to paint him as a villain, which if you read about Nixon, I was not alive during the Nixon presidency, but reading about him, not a great guy, did a lot of horrible things for the country. And it's interesting thinking about the current administration, watching this guy sort of vocally try to absolve himself of any guilt for the awful things that he did. It paints him as a very horrible racist. He says some really terrible racial slurs about some incredibly important people in this movie, and goes on some really awful tirades about immigrants and about all of these people, and really kind of just exposes the Republican agenda, which is, I thought, was incredibly fascinating. But what Altman does here too that I thought was so interesting was tries to provide empathy for him in moments as a human being. And I think that's what's so fascinating about this movie is like they're trying to view Nixon as a person who is fundamentally flawed, like fighting for his life because of the mistakes that he made. And then like in the third act of the film, trying to essentially come back around and say, I don't care, I did all this for a reason and I'd do it again, and they would love me for it. And I think that's so interesting because as I was watching this movie, it's clearly about a president who's already taken office, but some of the things that he was talking about, like when he was talking about JFK and like I would have beat him in the 60s, and then like talking about his assassination and all these really like interesting ideas. I think about Trump now and how vocally forward that he is about a lot of the things that in this movie Nixon is being like behind closed doors about, and how just thinking about like this was a filmmaker saying this guy's done a lot of things that might not necessarily be forward facing publicly, but that we can infer about him through his actions, and thinking about how the current administration doesn't even have the curtain up. It's just they are completely and totally forward about their evil. And I found that to be really fascinating because you always look at a movie like this in the time that it was made, and like this being reflective of the Nixon presidency and like him leaving office, and then the end of this movie with him kind of tirading about I could have got elected again, these people would have loved me and eaten out of my hand, and like it's fascinating to think the level of power that must go to one's head when they hold the most powerful position in the United States of America. And I just found so much of this movie to be interesting. And then like the inclusion of the revolver and the thought of like Nixon getting to a point where he might want to take his own life, but like his ego would never let him get in the way. And there's just so many little moments here of brilliance when it comes to just little things incorporated in the monologue. And like I said, being a lover of history, I got a lot of the references here, even though I didn't live through it, because I researched a lot of it when I was in school. And then growing up, I've always loved researching history. I think if you don't learn from history, it will repeat itself, as we are currently watching right now. And it's so important to be educated about history. And I get everyone's not going to know every single facet of history, but Nixon's administration has always been really fascinating to me. Everything about Watergate, I've always been really interested in that, and like how that was approached. And so watching a movie from a fictional perspective that sort of brought to light how Altman saw Nixon as a person, it was just a really entertaining and engaging experience. I'm very glad that you recommended this movie to me because it's probably not something I ever would have sought out on my own, but I'm really glad I checked it out. And I think if any of this sounds interesting to you, you should definitely watch it. So have you seen Secret Honor? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought. I thought this movie was really great. I honestly was completely and totally enthralled by it, and I would 100% watch it again. As always, if you like the video and subscribe to the channel, helps me out a lot and lets me know the type of content you're looking for. I'm always putting out new material and look forward to getting more out for you in the near future. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.